33-year-old Barbara Mendes looked down at the blank piece of paper in front of her. Rolling the pen under her fingers across the kitchen table, Barbara wished that writing or talking about her feelings was as easy for her as it was to make a delicious dinner or to embroider a piece of clothing or fine cloth. But it was coming up on Valentine's Day 1982, and Barbara had decided that this year she was going to give her two daughters not just cards and chocolates, but a letter that told them how much she loved them. Both the girls were at or close to the point where they were becoming teenagers. Dawn was 13 and Christy was 11. And more, Barbara could feel them beginning to pull away from their parents. Not that the girls had ever given Barbara or her husband Robin, known to everyone by his nickname Bob, any trouble, and the pulling away that Barb sensed now was not rebellious or painful. The girls were just growing up, and Barb knew from her own childhood, and now her perspective as a mom, that the time all of them were spending together now in their modest but cozy house tucked away among the woods would not last forever. Taking a deep breath, Barb stopped rolling the pen, she picked it up, she pressed the point carefully onto the paper, and she began to write. She opened with, "My daughters." 5 sentences later, and Barb was finished. Relaxing her grip on the pen, she read over what she had written. Then she put her pen down, she folded the letter, and slipped it into its envelope. But before getting up from the table and getting started on her to-do list of household, church, and work tasks that never seemed to end, Barb turned toward the window and looked out at the cold and snowy Wisconsin winter. She and Bob had lived in Minocqua, a town with 3,300 residents and only 3 traffic lights, ever since their marriage almost exactly 14 years ago on March 2nd, 1962. But even though it was so small, Minocqua was still bigger than the town where Barb had done most of her growing up. Not long after she'd been born, more than 200 miles to the south, in the bustling county seat of Manitowoc, Barb's parents had moved their family up to Boulder Junction, a tiny town of fewer than 500 people. Even if Barb's father, an aircraft mechanic who had served in the Navy during World War II, and her mother, who had stayed home to take care of Barb and her 3 sisters, had not been fairly conservative and religious people, Boulder Junction was so small that Barb might not even have heard about a lot of the cultural, political, and technological changes of the 1960s that started just a few years before Barb and Bob had gotten married. So, while other young couples in other parts of the country might be experimenting with sex, drugs, and rock and roll music, Barb and Bob had settled here in Minocqua, in their 3-bedroom house located just a half-mile away from sleepy Route 70 and the family-owned upholstery business where Bob worked. And for Barb, who was quiet and shy, this life suited her just fine, because Barb had never really needed that much anyway to make her feel grateful and blessed. Staring now at the snow-covered pine trees outside, Barb thought ahead to the arrival of spring and summer, and how she and her girls had always made the most of those 2 magical seasons, going out together to pick the berries that Barb would make into jars of fruit jellies and preserves, and enjoying the lakes that Minocqua was famous for in this part of the Northwoods. And always, as the girls got older, Barb had made a point of welcoming her daughter's friends for playdates and sleepovers, and doing everything she could to make sure that Minocqua felt less like a small town that people couldn't wait to leave, and more like the storybook version of Little House on the Prairie, where childhood was wholesome, fun, and safe. In fact, the biggest transformation in the social lives of Barb and Bob Mendes and their 2 kids had happened 3 years earlier. And it had nothing to do with popular culture and trends, and everything to do with the family's spiritual life. That was when Barb and Bob, along with a handful of other passionate believers in a conservative Christian denomination called Assemblies of God, had helped found a church of their own. Located about 8 miles west of the Mendes house, the new church had very quickly become the center of the family's social as well as spiritual life. Barb had become a Sunday school teacher, and Bob, who was more outgoing than his wife, was one of the church's youth group leaders. For all the Menendezes, church was where they formed their closest friendships. That's where Barb's older daughter, Dawn, could spend time with her best friend Jody, whose father was one of Bob's best friends. Barb's best friend was also a very active member of the church. Sherry Anderson, whose husband, Wendell, was the pastor, was as close to a confidant as the very private and reserved Barb Mendes had. It had been with Sherry's support and encouragement that Barb had picked up a part-time job starting about a year ago, working as a teller at the Park City Credit Union, which was located roughly halfway between the Mendes home and the Assemblies of God church. And suddenly, with that job, everything Barb could have wanted was within a 10-mile radius of where she sat right now. The church where she worshipped, the bank where she worked, and the family business where Bob worked installing carpets and upholstery. Every member of her family had become well known in this community. Bob out riding his motorcycle to work with his toolkit strapped on the back, the girls going off to school each day, and Barb herself, whose friendly manner and shy but beautiful smile had made her a favorite among the members of Park City Credit Union. But right now, as Barb continued to stare out the window of her kitchen, the Valentine's Day letter in its envelope on the table in front of her, she wondered exactly when and how her life seemed to have slipped out of its perfect frame. There were the recent bank robberies in the area, practically unbelievable in a town that hadn't seen a murder since 1935, and very few violent crimes of any type. And Barb had to admit that even though only one of those robberies was still unsolved, she felt scared every time she saw a customer in the bank who behaved in any way that struck her as out of the ordinary. But Barb also knew that her real trouble lay much closer to home. In fact, she worried that it lay right inside one of her favorite places on earth, the Assemblies of God Church. And lately, when she entered the worship area that meant so much to her and that had been her place of comfort and strength, Barb was now finding excuses to slip away so she could sit by herself in one of the meeting rooms, doing her best to hold back tears. 2.5 months later, on Wednesday, April 28, 1982, Barb packed the family car in the lot right behind the Park City Credit Union, located on Highway 51 in the city of Minocqua. It was a clear, sunny day, cold in the morning, but by afternoon, the temperature was supposed to double. As Barb closed the driver's side door of the car and headed for the bank, she was glad that after the long Wisconsin winter, it was finally starting to warm up. But despite the spring weather and sunshine, when Barb walked inside into the work area of the credit union, she had to force herself to smile as she said good morning to her boss, credit union manager Helen Gray, because the last 2 days had been hard for Barbara. 2 days earlier, on Monday the 26th, there had been an embarrassing incident at the Bible study meeting that Barb and Bob had gone to at a church member's home. And on the very next day, Tuesday, April 27th, Barb had a long phone conversation with her friend Sherry, the church pastor's wife. Barb could not bring herself to tell Sherry the real secret that weighed so heavily on Barb these days, but Barb did manage to reassure her friend that soon Barb would be taking steps to resolve the problem, and when that was done, Barb would be feeling much better. After ending that phone call, Barb had turned her attention to making dinner. But even though the Mexican food Barb had prepared, Bob's favorite, had gotten rave reviews, the evening had left Barb feeling tired, and she was still tired this morning as she counted the bills in her drawer and took her position behind the customer service counter. Then, as Helen walked across the lobby to open the bank doors for business, Barb gave herself a mental shake. Making sure her white blouse was neatly tucked into her dark skirt, Barb squared her shoulders as the first customer stepped up to her station. But by midday, Barb's workload had unexpectedly doubled. Helen, the bank manager, had started to feel sick, and by 1 p.m., she felt so bad that she and Barb had decided that Helen should just go home and let Barb finish out the day and close the bank on her own. About 4 hours after Helen had left, Barb was helping the last customer of the day, one of the members of the credit union's own board of directors, who was there to convert $55 in change into dollar bills. Even if Barb hadn't been alone for half of her shift, that Wednesday still would have felt like an unusually stressful day, because that afternoon, Barb had had a scary interaction with a customer named Thomas Bowes, who kicked up a fuss when she told him that because he wasn't a member of the credit union, she could not cash the check he had handed to her. When he came back a second time after filling out a membership card and Barb did cash the check, his irritability and the argument he got into with his brother, who was with him, made Barb wish she was not alone behind the counter. All she'd been able to think about were the 2 recent bank robberies in the area and the fact that the suspect in one of those robberies was still on the loose. Chatting now about that encounter with the credit union board member, Barb relaxed a little as she rolled the last of the coins into its paper sleeve, handed over the dollar bills in exchange, and then walked her final customer to the door. As she watched the man cross the parking lot and get into his car and wave back at her, Barb felt a rush of relief that it was finally 5 o'clock and her workday was almost over. and after locking the door behind her, Barb headed back to the office to start entering that day's transactions into the balance sheet. But Barb hardly had time to sit down, catch her breath, and pull up the credit union balance sheet to make her first few entries when she heard a knock on the front door of the building. Startled, Barb dropped her pencil and looked up. But the entrance to the bank wasn't visible from the desk where she was sitting, and the only way to see who was there knocking was to get up and walk past the service counter and out into the lobby and waiting area. Barb looked at the time. The bank had been closed for almost 15 minutes, but even as Barb was deciding whether she should go to the door and see who it was, or, still thinking about the recent bank robberies, call the police, she heard the knock again. And this time, she thought she could make out a voice she recognized. Taking her hand away from the telephone on her desk, Barb waited a few seconds for her heart to stop racing. Then, the 33-year-old wife and mother of two stood up, made a wide loop around the counter, and headed for the front door. A little over 2.5 hours later, at close to 8 p.m. that night, the first police and emergency medical vehicles were pulling up in the parking lot outside the City Park Credit Union, sirens on and lights flashing. There to meet them was the credit union manager, Helen Gray, who had placed the 911 call to the Minocqua Police Department a few minutes earlier at 7:43 p.m. Still in a state of shock, Helen walked into the credit union with police officer Norm McMahon and led him behind the service counter to a space between one of the staff desks and the bank safe located behind the desk and against the side wall of the bank. Sprawled inside of that space, police found the brutally beaten body of Barb Mendes. And even as Helen and the police officer stepped back to let medical technicians check for signs of life, it was clear that Barbara was dead. Her wavy shoulder-length brown hair was matted with blood, and the left side of her skull, face, and ear showed cuts and drag marks from whatever weapon had been used to kill her. From the position of her body, it looked like Barb's attacker had struck her from behind, and at some point during or after the attack, the murderer had rolled her body over so she was lying across her left arm, while her right arm, the fingers curled upward in a loose fist, was stretched out along her right side. Blood from Barbara's injuries had spread out in a wide pool around her head, too much to be fully absorbed by the thick carpet underneath her. The cash drawer at the counter where Barb had worked that day was open, and a total of what would turn out to be $2,700 was missing. The Minocqua Police Department may not have investigated a homicide in almost 50 years, but Officer McMahon's training kicked in right away. After giving directions to secure the crime scene and get crime scene techs to the bank as soon as possible, one of Officer McMahon's first calls was to Barbara's husband, Bob. It had been Bob who had called the manager of the credit union earlier that evening at 7:15 after Barb had failed to show up at church for the 7 p.m. Wednesday service. Even though Barb had called him earlier that day to say that she would be working late, she had also told Bob that she'd be home in time to pick up the girls and join him at church for the 7 p.m. service. Figuring that Helen's home was closer to the bank than the church was, Bob had asked the manager of the credit union if she would make the 1.5-mile trip to Park City Credit Union to check on Barb. Already feeling guilty that she had left Barb alone to close up the bank that evening, Helen immediately hopped into her car with her daughter and did what Bob asked her to do. And just 27 minutes later, Helen had made her gruesome discovery, and with shaking hands, she had dialed 911. But even as police were setting up a perimeter of yellow crime scene tape around the bank and arranging for Bob to identify his wife's body, investigators from both the Minocqua Police Department and the Oneida County Sheriff's Department, which had also responded to the emergency call, had already put together two possible theories that would explain the crime scene and Barb's murder. The first theory was that Barb had been the tragic victim of a bank robbery gone wrong. That theory fit neatly with the fact that there had been a recent rash of robberies in the area, that the perpetrator in one of the robberies was still at large, and that approximately $2,700 was missing from Barb's cash drawer. The second theory was that the motive for the murder was personal, and that Barb's attacker had made off with the money so it would look like a robbery. This theory, that Barbara knew her attacker, would explain why there was no sign of forced entry into the credit union, why the assailant had not taken any of the $17,000 in cash that was sitting in plain sight inside the open safe just a few feet away from Barb's body, and why Barb's attacker was apparently able to walk right up behind her and strike her on the back of the head. Over the next 2 months, officers from the Minocqua and nearby Rhinelander police departments, along with the deputies from the sheriff's department, had a total of 10 investigators working more than 12 hours a day on the Barb Mendes homicide. With other officers also donating their off-duty time to help, law enforcement would interview more than 100 witnesses, as well as follow up on a barrage of tips and rumors. They had questioned people who had transacted business at the credit union that day, as well as shoppers and store owners at the business center near the bank. They had combed the wooded areas along Highway 51 where the credit union was located, looking for a murder weapon they did not find, and they had collected as much physical evidence from the crime scene as possible without coming up with any blood samples or fingerprints that would lead them to a possible killer. But despite the hours that law enforcement had poured into this investigation, by mid-May, 6 weeks after Barb's death, police investigating both theories of the crime had hit one dead end after another. As the husband of the victim, Barb Mendes was automatically at the top of the suspect list. But Bob was also among the first suspects that police had to cross off their list. From the time Bob arrived home from work at Lakeland Upholstery at about 5 p.m. until sometime after 8 p.m. when he arrived at the Park City Credit Union, Bob could account for all his actions and whereabouts. Bob's alibi was confirmed 3 days later when they followed up their initial interviews with Bob and Barb's daughters, Dawn and Christy, with long interviews at the police station where they took down the family members' formal statements. Both Dawn and Christy, who had gotten home from school on the day of their mother's murder at about 4:20 p.m., had seen their dad come home about a half hour later, just before 5 p.m. Just after 5, their dad had passed along a phone message from their mom telling them she'd be home by 6:15 or 6:30. And since Dad would be riding his motorcycle to church that evening, Barb would drive the girls to the 7 p.m. service with her. After that phone call, Bob and the girls had a quick dinner of tacos. Dawn's best friend Jody had also spoken to Bob around 5:15 or 5:30 when she telephoned the Mendes house, and Bob had answered the phone. After that, Bob had showered, dressed, and then hopped on his 1979 Honda CX-5000 motorcycle and left for church, where church members would see him at about 6:20 p.m. But aside from confirming that Bob did not leave the church again until he got the call from police that Barb was dead, members of the Assemblies of God Church just did not seem that eager to share information about each other's lives and church politics or gossip with police. And Barb's funeral service, which was held on the same day that Christy, Dawn, and Bob were all formally interviewed, did not offer any clues about Barb's personal life either. As a few police officers watched from their seats in the back of the church, 300 mourners filled into the sanctuary of the Assemblies of God on Town Line Road. Pastor Wendell Anderson described Barb as, quote, a woman who had committed her life to the Lord, end quote, before reading some of Barb's favorite verses from the Bible. The next day, the local newspaper would quote one of Barb's friends and fellow church members as saying that Barbara's death, quote, did not fit her life in any way, end quote. And then, this friend summed up the fear that had gripped the entire town of Minocqua in the wake of Barb's murder, the first homicide the sleepy town had seen since 1935. Quote, it's all just horrible, end quote. Meanwhile, as the Minocqua Police Department started focusing its efforts on finding suspects who may have had a personal motive for killing Barb, the Oneida County Sheriff's Department was focusing more and more on the theory that Barb was a victim of a robbery gone wrong. And for them, suspect number 1 was Thomas Bowes, the argumentative man who had visited the Park City Credit Union 2 times on April 28th, the day of Barb's murder. Because, as police soon discovered, Thomas had a prior criminal conviction from 5 years earlier for committing a robbery without a weapon. And when Thomas Bowes' wife, Judith, started changing her story about her husband's activities and whereabouts on the day of Barb's murder, police zeroed in on the man at least one officer privately described as more of a, quote, goof than a danger to society. But, like all the other leads police had uncovered in the case, the Thomas Bowes lead would dry up 9 months after Barb's murder in the end of January 1983, when Thomas passed a lie detector test. And meanwhile, other leads involving other robbery suspects would also hit a dead end. But by the fall of 1982, 3 months before Thomas Bowes was crossed off the suspect list, residents of Minocqua were all talking about a different crime that had just been reported in their local newspapers. And like Barb's death, this crime also involved a member of the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road, the same church that Bob and Barb had helped found 3 years earlier. In October 1982, 6 months after Barb's murder, the church was rocked by an allegation that one of its members had been sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. The charge resulted in the perpetrator being sentenced to 4 years of probation, but the scandal also had the effect of breathing new life into the stalled investigation into Barb's murder. Law enforcement had no evidence that linked the two crimes, but officers decided to take another run at interviewing church members about what might have been going on in the church at or around the time that Barb was killed. They also re-interviewed Bob. Barb's husband had raised eyebrows when he'd started dating a new girlfriend earlier that fall, but when police re-interviewed him in October, nothing about his alibi or about the statements his daughters had made to police 6 months earlier had changed at all. And by the spring of 1984, 2 years after Barb had been murdered, the investigation into her death once more stuttered to a halt, and the key players in the drama were all starting to move on with their lives. On March 10th of 1984, Bob had remarried and his new wife had moved into the Mendes house, where she would do her best to fill the terrible hole that Barb's death 2 years earlier had left in the lives of Barb and Bob's daughters, Dawn and Christy. Meanwhile, the sex abuse scandal at the Assemblies of God Church would fade from the headlines. The $5,500 reward for information leading to a conviction in the murder case of Barb Mendes would go unclaimed, and contributions to an educational fund for Dawn and Christy would slow to a trickle. The only other progress in the investigation would be DNA tests that cleared rather than convicted one remaining suspect in the rash of robberies that had occurred near the time of Barb's death, along with a visit to the police from a Minocqua resident who dropped off a particular tool that they thought might match the type of weapon that had been used to beat Barbara Mendes to death. So this tool that was dropped off was an example of what the murder weapon could have been, not the actual murder weapon. Investigators established the Minocqua resident's alibi. They took a picture of the tool, made a note, and filed the information away inside a case file that now included thousands of pages. And if it hadn't been for the sheer persistence and determination of Barbara's own daughters, that huge case file might never have been opened again. Because, in the course of getting on with their own adult lives, both Christy and Dawn had joined forces and become determined not to rest until they had discovered who had killed their mother. Starting back in 2002, 20 years after Barbara was murdered, Dawn, now 33 years old, and Christy, now 31 years old, began a relentless campaign aimed at getting police to reopen the investigation into their mother's death. That included writing a letter in 2016 to the producers of the true crime television show titled Cold Justice, asking them to take a look into the unsolved murder of their mother. And in February of 2017, the two women finally got the response they had been pleading for. 35 years after Barb's murder, and almost a year after dropping that letter off in the mail, the Cold Justice team of investigators accepted the challenge. And 1 year after that, police, with the help of the investigators from Cold Justice, finally closed in on a murderer who had eluded them for more than 3 decades. When the arrest came on February 6, 2018, nearly 36 years after Dawn and Christy first learned that their mother was dead, it was the result of an intense 2-week-long partnership between Cold Justice and the Oneida County Sheriff's Office. During those 2 weeks, the team of investigators reviewed the entire case file on the murder of Barbara Mendes from beginning to end. And after hiring a forensic weapons expert to help identify what instrument was used to kill Barb, and talking again with 3 key witnesses, as well as Barb's old church friend Sherry Anderson, wife of church pastor Wendell Anderson, police uncovered the truth about one of the most infamous murders that has ever occurred in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. Based on that investigation, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Barbara Mendes on April 28, 1982. By the time 33-year-old Barbara Mendes had closed and locked the door of the Park City Credit Union on that Wednesday evening in late April, she was physically and emotionally exhausted. She'd been thinking over the events of the last several days and about the concerns she had shared with her friend Sherry when they talked by phone just the night before. But Barbara had not told Sherry everything, and even now, knowing what Barb did, Barb wasn't sure that Sherry or anyone else at the church would really be able to understand the decision that Barb felt like she had to make. Walking back to her desk, Barb sat down and started making her first entries into that day's bank transaction record. The quicker she could get this done, the sooner she would be home with her 2 daughters, and the sooner they would all be at the 7 p.m. church service where Barb could talk again to her friend Sherry. 10 minutes later, the sudden and unexpected knock on the front door of the bank made Barb jump. Her first thought was that it might be a bank robber, and Barb felt her heart start to hammer in her chest. But as soon as Barb heard the voice that was calling to her from outside the bank, she stopped reaching for the phone to call police. This was a voice that Barb recognized, and this was a conversation that Barb knew she could no longer avoid having. Taking a deep breath, Barb pushed her chair back, stood up, and began walking towards the door. For Barb's killer, as well as for Barb, this was a moment of decision. And standing now in the shadow of the entryway to the credit union, the killer listened first to the silence inside, and then to the sound of footsteps, and then to the key turning in the lock. A moment later, and the killer was inside. The killer reached out a hand, but Barb moved away. Turning, she walked back over to her desk. She had read the Bible. She knew what the scriptures had to say about the kind of relationship she had observed and the kind of person who got involved in that sort of relationship. Their conversation did not last long. The killer had denied everything, but Barb had spent weeks watching and listening, and Barb could no longer stand by and let this relationship go on. The killer stood in front of her and bowed their head. Barb reached down and picked up the bills she had collected out of the cash drawers. Signaling that the visit was now over, Barb turned her back and took 3 steps in the direction of the open safe. All she wanted now was to end this encounter, to finish her work, and to get home to her kids. But the killer could not let that happen. As soon as Barb had turned toward the safe, the killer reached into their coat pocket to pull out the metal pry bar they had hidden there. The flat end of the tool fit comfortably in their hand. At the other end of the shaft, the claw tip bent at an angle, giving the tool the same overall shape as a short flat crowbar with flat, sharp, beveled ends. Quietly, the killer took a single long step toward Barb's back. Once they were just within striking distance, the killer raised the pry bar high over their left shoulder and then brought it down with terrible force against the back left side of Barb's skull. Once Barb had collapsed to the floor, the killer stepped over to her body. Grabbing her right arm, the killer rolled Barb onto her side so her left arm was stretched underneath her chest. Tightening their grip on the pry bar, the killer bent down and began beating Barb's head and the left side of her face, dragging the curved end of the bar again and again through her hair and skin, making ragged cuts and scratches across her cheek and tearing away part of her left ear. The autopsy that would be performed on Barb's body the next day, Thursday, April 29th, would catalog a total of at least 17 blows to Barbara's head, all resulting in extensive skull fractures. The total absence of any defensive wounds suggested that the attack took Barb completely by surprise, and the first blow was so disabling that Barb never even had a chance to fight back or protect herself in any way. Now, looking down at Barb's body, the killer rested their palms against their knees. The pry bar in the fingers of one hand glistened red in the single overhead light. Waiting to catch their breath, the killer watched as the pool of blood under Barb's head widened across the carpet. And then, standing up, the killer set about making the murder look like the scene of a robbery gone wrong. In a few fast movements, the killer had grabbed a deposit bag from Barbara's desk that contained about $2,700 in that day's transactions, leaving Barbara's cash drawer behind the service counter open and empty. Pausing just long enough to make sure they were not leaving anything behind that could reveal their identity, the killer walked to the front entrance with the pry bar and bag of cash, and then, making sure not to leave any fingerprints, the killer slipped out of the Park City Credit Union. Glancing at their watch, the killer was surprised to find that the entire encounter with Barb, ending with her death, had taken fewer than 10 minutes. Still, it was the critical window of time, part of maybe 30 minutes that police would come up with as the time the murder was committed, and the killer knew they had to find a way to place themselves during this half-hour period far away from the credit union. But the killer wasn't worried. After all, teenagers did not really pay very close attention to what time it was, and the killer knew it would be easy to manipulate and coach the people closest to him into providing him with the perfect alibi. A few minutes later, just after 5:30 p.m., Barb Mendes, Barbara's husband and killer, arrived back at the family home on Hill North Dale Road. The bloody pry bar that he had just used 15 minutes earlier to murder his wife was securely locked in the toolbox on the back of his Honda CX-5000 motorcycle. And by the morning of May 1st, 3 days after Barb's death, the most important pieces of Bob's plan to cover up for his crime fell neatly into place. When investigators brought Bob and his 2 daughters down to the police station that morning to give their formal statements about where they were and what they were doing on the evening that Barbara was murdered, the only times that the 2 devastated teenagers could seem to remember about exactly where their father was between 4:55 and 6:45 on the night of their mother's murder were the times that their father had told them. Yes, Dawn and Christy told investigators, their father had been home before 5 p.m. Yes, he had stayed at the house until close to 6 p.m., when he had left on his motorcycle to drive to church. And Bob still had one more important witness that he could also count on for helping him create a watertight alibi. And that person was his daughter Dawn's best friend, 14-year-old Jody, the teenager that Bob had been sexually abusing for almost an entire year, the teenager that Bob had promised to marry as soon as he could end his marriage to Barb. It would turn out that Robin Bob Mendes was not at all the good Christian and the fine husband and devoted father he pretended to be. And by February of 1982, when his wife, Barb Mendes, sat down to write a Valentine's Day letter to her 2 daughters, Barb had already begun to put together the true picture of who her husband was. Not only did Barb know that her marriage was in trouble, she had also begun to suspect that her husband was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a girl who was just barely 14 years old. And not only was this girl close friends with their own daughters, Jody was also the daughter of Bob's own best friend, as well as a member of Bob's youth group at the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road. By the spring of 1982, rumors and whispers had begun to swirl inside the church about the amount of time and attention that Bob was lavishing on Jody. And members also noticed that Bob and Barb Mendes no longer sat together at church services, and on one occasion, they had arrived in separate cars at a Bible study meeting at a member's home, with Barb looking and acting so visibly upset that everyone in the group had felt extremely uncomfortable and embarrassed. By late April, Barb had begun to confide to her friend Sherry that she was worried about the relationship between Bob and Jody, and that Barb had decided she needed to confront her husband. If he did not stop all contact with Jody and start working on his marriage, Barb had decided she was going to take her daughters and leave Bob and go stay with her own parents, who now lived out in Colorado. But Barb never had the chance to put that plan into effect and to help rescue a vulnerable teenage girl from an abusive relationship with Barb's husband. Instead, on April 28th, Bob, the only person aside from the bank manager who knew Barb would be closing the credit union alone that evening, showed up after finishing his work at Lakeland Upholstery at the Park City Credit Union. Armed with the pry bar he used almost every day and carried with him in his toolbox, Bob knocked on the locked door of the bank and called out to Barb, telling her that he needed and wanted to talk. And just a few minutes after opening the door to Bob, Barb had been beaten to death by her husband of 14 years. After Barb's murder, Jody, who had also been coached and manipulated by Bob, joined with his daughters in giving him a fake alibi. It wouldn't be until 6 months later, when police investigated allegations that Bob was sexually abusing Jody, that Jody broke down and told police that she had been lying when she said that she had talked to Bob on the Mendes house phone at about 5 p.m. on the night that Barb was killed. But laws and public perception regarding sexual abuse were a lot different in 1982 than they are today, and police were skeptical about Jody's corrected testimony. And even though Bob pled no contest to the charges and was convicted of sexual assault on a minor, he was only sentenced to 3 years of probation. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Jody was savaged in the press and by her own father for being a temptress and a slut and an adulterer. But even though Bob's now public relationship with Jody gave him a motive for wanting his wife Barb dead, he still had the perfect alibi, the one provided by his deeply traumatized daughters, Christy and Dawn. It wasn't until 2002, when the daughters were in their early 30s and started looking back over their childhood, and in particular their father's behavior after their mother was murdered, that they began to realize how obviously and completely they had been coached, manipulated, brainwashed, and used by their own father, the man who never even purchased a headstone for his dead wife and who never once took his kids to see her grave. The man who had been seen by 2 different witnesses leaving the credit union on his motorcycle during the window of time in which the murder was committed. The man who suddenly had enough cash right after that murder to buy himself an expensive new motorcycle and who painted his motorcycle helmet a different color. The man who failed a lie detector test 5 weeks after the murder of his wife. The man who not only sexually assaulted their own good friend Jody, but who would later go to prison for 8 years for sexually abusing a 5-year-old girl, and the man whose own brother would go to the Oneida County Sheriff's Department in 2002 and suggest that the murder weapon they were looking for might be a pry bar, one of the tools that his brother, Barb Mendes, used so often at work that Bob took it with him everywhere in his portable toolkit. But it wouldn't be until 2017 when investigators from the TV series Cold Justice teamed up with the Oneida County Sheriff's Department that law enforcement was finally able to break Barb Mendes's perfect alibi. Not only did they now have the testimony of Bob's own daughters that the alibi was fabricated, they were also able to track down and interview Jody, the survivor of Bob's sexual abuse. Now a successful adult in a happy marriage, Jody had gone on to work in law enforcement and to be a voice for other victims of crime and abuse. And this time, investigators believed her testimony that she had not spoken to Bob at his home during the critical window of time when police believed Barb had been murdered. On February 6, 2018, Robin Barb Mendes was arrested in the parking lot of a Minocqua Walmart store and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Barbara Mendes. On July 23, 2019, Barb Mendes was sentenced to life in prison. Because he was sentenced under guidelines in force at the time of the crime, 1982, he will be eligible for parole in 2039 at the age of 91. Included in the documents that Dawn and Christy had sent to the producers of Cold Justice when they asked the show's investigators to take on the unsolved murder of their mother was the Valentine's Day letter that Barbara had written to her daughters 35 years earlier. Barb's friends and family now believe that by mid-February 1982, 6 weeks before Barb was bludgeoned to death by her husband, Barb had begun to suspect Bob of sexual abuse, and that Barb herself may have felt that dark events were about to unfold in their lives. This is the Valentine's Day message that Barb wrote to 11-year-old Christy and 13-year-old Dawn with all of that in mind. My daughters. Sometimes mothers don't always take the time to tell their daughters just how much they are loved and appreciated. Our lives can go by so fast and we will have missed so much together. So, on this Valentine's Day, I want to tell you how much I love you. You are so special to me as daughters. Have a nice Valentine's Day and every day. I love you, your mother.
Late one night in the summer of 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio intercepted a very unique signal. The telescope was searching the sky on behalf of an organization called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the signal, although it only lasted 72 seconds, fit the profile of a message beamed to us from another world. Jerry Amon, who was a project scientist for SETI, was flipping through some of the computer printouts generated by the telescope when he noticed a series of letters. Now, the way this particular radio telescope worked is it pretty much constantly picked up a signal, but that signal was a very low background hum of static, and that was represented in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those low numbers are representative of that basic background sound that they just write off. It doesn't matter. Occasionally, the telescope would pick up a higher number on the readout, like a 7, an 8, a 9, and even above that, it transitions to letters to represent louder radio signals. But all of those higher signals had a rational explanation. Either they were anomalous or they were tied to something very natural and ordinary. But that particular night in 1977, as the telescope swept across the sky, it picked up a signal that was so strong it surged past 0 through 9 and made its way into the letters all the way up to letter U, and it held it for 72 seconds, representing a signal that was 30 times stronger than what this telescope normally picks up as its baseline. And after those 72 seconds, the telescope eventually passed it, and that signal dropped all the way back down. So when Amon saw this amazing string of letters representing this radio signal, he circled it in red ink and wrote next to it, "Wow!" exclamation point, and from that point forward, this transmission became the WOW signal. One of the main reasons the WOW signal was not immediately cast out as some anomaly or chalked up to some other natural occurrence is because of what we understand about radio wave transmission. The goal of this radio telescope was to try to pick up radio signals coming in from other worlds. And so the way they did that is they opened up a whole bunch of different channels, receivers, they had 50 of them, and anytime they were aiming their dish in a direction of the sky, if there was any radio waves coming towards them, they tried to capture them on different radio frequencies. If you were aiming your antenna in a direction where natural radio waves were coming towards you, it would hit one channel and then diffuse over adjacent channels because it's not a targeted radio wave. It's natural. It's more like a shotgun blast. Non-natural radio waves, like the ones we're familiar with when we listen to the radio, listen to music, those are targeted radio waves, meaning when they were sent out in a very narrow band. They were sent out on a single frequency. And only people that have turned to that particular frequency or that particular receiver are going to hear your message. That is a non-natural radio wave. The night that the WOW signal was picked up, it was only picked up on one channel. It did not diffuse over the others, meaning the WOW signal is not natural and was created by someone or something. And for the SETI researchers that are literally combing the sky for signs of extraterrestrial life, this is exactly what they were looking for. It is what an intelligent life form would do to try to communicate. They would use one radio frequency to demonstrate this is intentional. But despite decades of professional and amateur astronomers searching the sky for this WOW signal, it's never been found again. While there's many theories about what could have caused the WOW signal, obviously ranging from extraterrestrial life to a comet that passed by in 1977 that we only recently knew about, to a secret spy satellite, the bottom line is, to this day, we cannot adequately explain it. It remains the best evidence of alien communication ever obtained.
Our next story is called Better Than Earth.
Just 30 years ago, we had not discovered a single planet outside of our solar system. Today, we've discovered over 4,500 of them, and of all those planets we're discovering, 1 in 5 of them, scientists now say, are most likely habitable. There's really 2 criteria for a planet to be considered habitable. 1, it needs to be rocky, and 2, it needs to fall into the Goldilocks zone, where it's in its star's orbit in a place where it's neither too hot or too cold, allowing water to be in liquid form. One of the best chances we have so far at finding life on another one of these habitable planets is a planet called Ross 128b. It orbits an inactive red dwarf star, meaning it's likely not being bludgeoned by solar radiation, and we've detected strange signals emanating from the nearby host star, signals that perhaps have intelligent origins. Another habitable planet is Proxima b. It also happens to be the closest habitable planet to Earth, and is a lot like Ross 128b. However, the red dwarf it revolves around is much more temperamental and periodically casts out massive amounts of radiation that does make life quite difficult. It's also tidally locked and in synchronous rotation with its star, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the star and getting completely torched all the time. The other side, the dark side of the planet, never faces the star, and so everything is frozen. And so the only place liquid water could exist on Proxima b would be at the equator. Another area of the universe that scientists are focused on to try to see if there's life there right now, or could be life, is an area called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's actually 7 different planets, all of which are considered habitable, that are orbiting around this one particular red dwarf. The really cool thing about this particular system is that the 7 planets are super close together. So close that if you were standing on one, you could look up and see all of the others, and you're so close you could actually make out geologic formations like mountains, and you could see clouds, and in theory, you could actually travel between the different planets. So imagine going on vacation to another planet. But to really get you thinking, a new study just released its results in October 2020. They looked at all 4,500 plus planets that are outside the solar system, and they ranked them according to how likely they are to sustain life. Not whether they're currently sustaining life, but looking at their conditions of how good of a planet are they to sustain life. And out of the 4,500, there were 24 at the top of the list that not only can sustain life, but actually can sustain life better than Earth can. They are considered super habitable, and they are literally better places to live than Earth is, which is definitely a foreign concept for most people because they think of Earth as like this oasis in this vast universe where everything lined up perfectly to sustain human life. And already, just out of the 4,500 planets that were reviewed that have only been discovered in the past 30 years, right? There's lots more planets out there. We've already found 24 that are better than Earth at sustaining life. So what happens when we discover there are millions, if not billions of planets out there? Just probability alone says there's going to be a heck of a lot more planets out there that are better at sustaining life than Earth. Which really forces you to come to terms with the reality that almost certainly we are not alone.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Don't Sleep.
Late on the evening of July 27th, 1977, a 21-year-old farmer named Huang Yan Cho walked down a wide, dusty road in the little farming village of Beigao, located in northern China. It had been a very hard day on the rice farm where Huang worked because they were all preparing for the autumn harvest. But even though Huang was totally exhausted and worn down, as he walked down this road, he was whistling an upbeat tune. Because for the first time in a long time, Huang was actually excited about the future. Huang had grown up in a poor family, and he hadn't even finished elementary school. He still lived with his parents in a tiny house, and basically every day of his life was the same. He got up at sunrise, he walked to work, he worked all day until he barely could even stand, and then he would walk home and he would go to bed. But the reason Huang was now feeling kind of excited about his future was because he had just gotten engaged to a beautiful girl in a neighboring village, and their plan was to get married after the autumn harvest. Huang was already hard at work, literally building them a house that they could move into after they got married. And in fact, on this particular night, that was where Huang was going. He was going to the property where he was in the middle of building this house, and he was going there not to work on the house anymore, but really just to admire his property, because again, he was just so excited about the future. Huang turned the corner and his beautiful half-constructed home came into focus. The foundation, the walls, and the ceiling were all complete. All he had left to do was put in the windows and the doors. And so Huang walked up and ran his hand over the beautiful brick he had laid around the outside of the property. Brick was not cheap. He had worked extra hours to afford this brick. And so he was just so proud of it. He ran his hand over it. And then he kind of stepped back and kind of imagined the house when it was all done. And then when he felt satisfied that he had seen enough, he just kind of nodded and turned and just continued walking back towards his home, his parents' home, which was only a few minutes away. When Huang got to his home, he went inside and his mom already had a meal made for him. It was just some rice and veggies. And so Huang sat down and began eating, and then his parents came over and they began chatting. And then, of course, the conversation shifted to Huang's upcoming marriage, because that's basically all Huang ever wanted to talk about. And then by about 10 p.m., Huang was so tired that he crawled into his bed and he fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, when Huang's parents woke up, they discovered that Huang was not in his bed. Now, this was not totally unusual, because they knew their son was a really hard worker, and it wasn't unusual for him to wake up really, really early to head out to the farm to begin his workday. But a little while later, the workers at the rice farm where Huang worked, they saw Huang had not come to work, and because that was so out of character for him, one of the workers actually walked to Huang's parents' home to see if he was okay. And when Huang's mother found out her son had not shown up to work, she was really worried, but she told this worker, my son must have gone to the house he's building, go over there and see if he's there. But the worker from the rice farm went to Huang's property he was building and nobody was there. And so when he came back and told Huang's mother, this sent her into a total panic, because really for her, this was like completely out of character for her son. He would never miss work. He would never just disappear like this. Something was wrong. So Huang's mother sent this rice farm worker to go find her husband and tell him what was going on with Huang. And then in the meantime, Huang's mother just walked outside and began going door to door, asking neighbors if they knew where her son was and if they wouldn't mind coming out and helping her look. Now, at this time, the village of Beigao was a relatively small place where all the residents more or less knew each other. And so it did not take long for the news of Huang being missing to spread all across Beigao, and the community really came out in force to go look for him. And so by the afternoon, you had villagers all over the place, literally biking all around town, calling out for Huang. People had gone to neighboring villages to see if he was there. Some other people went to Huang's fiance's home and spoke directly to the fiance, but she had no idea where Huang had gone. And so by about the early afternoon, when so many people couldn't find any leads to where Huang had gone, it became clear that really nobody had a clue what happened to him. Now, Beigao at the time was incredibly isolated. This is a small town where most of the people who live there don't have phones, they don't have cars, they ride their bikes everywhere, and there were no roads that connected Beigao to any other place. Now, there was a paved road that went through Beigao, but it actually just came to an end on the outskirts of Beigao. So there was just no way to go to other places, at least not efficiently. Basically, if you lived in Beigao at the time, there was a finite number of places you could go. And all these people that had gone out looking for Huang had searched all of those places, and Huang just was not there. And they discovered his bike was still leaning up against his parents' house, and his work clothes, which he wore basically every single day, were still folded up neatly inside of his room. And so wherever Huang was, he was on foot and he was still in his pajamas. That night, Huang's parents would contact the village committee, which was basically like the governing body for Beigao, and the village committee decided that this was serious enough, because again, they're thinking, this is impossible, where is this guy? That they decided to contact the police. But when the police got this call, they did not launch an investigation right away because they had limited resources and there was no sign of foul play here. It was very weird that Huang was missing, but he was an adult, and if he wanted to go vanish somewhere, it was kind of like, okay, you're an adult, you can do that. And so Huang's family and the rest of the Beigao villagers were forced to just kind of wait and see if Huang came back. But over the next few days, Huang did not come back, and there was still no new information about what might have happened to him. Early on the morning of August 5th, so 8 days after Huang went missing, and still by this point there's no sign of him, the deputy director of the Beigao Village Committee came running up the road to Huang's parents' house and knocked on the door. When the door opened up, it was Huang's father, and the deputy director handed him a telegram he had just gotten and said, "Read it." And so Huang's father took the telegram and began reading it, and as he did, his eyes went wide. And then when he was done, he looked up and he was just so confused. The telegram had been sent 8 days earlier at around 9 a.m. on July 28th. So basically right around the time that Huang's family discovered Huang was missing was when this telegram was sent. But for whatever reason, the telegram had been very delayed, and so they were just receiving this telegram now, 8 days later. And the contents of this telegram made no sense. It said that just 9 hours after Huang had fallen asleep in his parents' home, he was discovered lying on the sidewalk in the middle of this bustling city called Nanjing, located 600 miles to the north of Beigao. Now, the reason Huang's father and the deputy director were so confused by this telegram was this was impossible. Remember, Huang does not have a car, so the only way he could get around was on foot or on his bike, and we know he left his bike by his house, so he's on foot and very likely in his pajamas, and what, he's gonna go 600 miles to the north? I mean, even if he walked the 30 miles to the nearest train station, 9 hours, because that's how much time it took from falling asleep to being discovered in the city, is not enough time to go the remaining 570 miles to Nanjing. So Huang's father and the deputy director, they talked about this, and they both decided that, this just can't be true. Clearly, somebody has mistaken some other person for Huang, because he cannot possibly be all the way in Nanjing. Now, this telegram said that Huang was being held in a deportation center in Shanghai, and so Huang's father and the deputy director decided they would send a telegram back to the sender at this deportation center and tell them, hey, if this really is Huang, he should have a very specific birthmark on his wrist. And so when they sent this telegram off, they fully expected to get one back that said, our mistake, it wasn't him. But they got a reply relatively quickly, and it said, oh yeah, he's got that exact birthmark. It's definitely Huang, but he's very confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. And so somebody from your village has to go get him. Huang arrived back home in the middle of August, so about 2 weeks after he had gone missing. And as soon as he got there, his fiancée and his parents were so happy to see him, and pretty soon a steady stream of friends and neighbors and other family members began coming to Huang's house to talk to him, to hear his story, to hear about what happened. I mean, this is a tiny, isolated place in the middle of rural China. Not a lot of exciting things happen out here, and so people were really excited to hear what Huang had to say. But Huang really didn't understand what had happened to him, and so mostly he just didn't answer any questions he got asked. He just kind of kept his head down and just kept saying, I don't know what happened. And then really when his family pressed him and said, you gotta tell us, this is so crazy, what happened? He would say, look, I'm gonna tell you what happened, but I don't even know if I can believe the things I'm gonna tell you. And so Huang would say, all he could remember was he went to bed in his own bed in Beigao. And then the next morning he woke up and he was laying on the sidewalk. And when he opened his eyes, he saw there was this big swimming pool, and then near it was a sign that said Nanjing. And so that was how he put together that he was in Nanjing. And then almost immediately, these 2 police officers wearing all white just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and they walked up to Huang, they scooped him up, and without really saying anything to him, they brought him to that deportation center in Shanghai, which is a place where people who seem confused or mentally ill would be sent in order to help them get home. And that was it. That was Huang's entire story, that he just basically woke up in Nanjing with no idea how he got there. And so after he told his family, they all just kind of looked at him like, really? Like, that's what happened? That makes no sense. But Huang, he was completely lucid. He was explaining it really specifically and really simply. He looked and sounded exactly like he normally did, and he seemed very honest as he was telling the story. Over the next few weeks, Huang kind of reintegrated back into his life, but things just were not the same. People were now scared of him. Kids literally ran away from him when they saw him because rumors were going around town that he himself, his body, was haunted or something. And so kids were scared of him, and other villagers would openly gossip about him right in front of him. Even his beloved fiancée admitted to feeling really uncomfortable around him now. And while all of this was obviously very upsetting for Huang, he did also understand why people were acting this way. This is a very anomalous thing that's happened to him, and he did not have a good explanation for this totally insane event that he was a part of. And so he just kind of got it. And in fact, Huang himself was kind of terrified of himself. At night when he would go to bed, he would be terrified that the second he closed his eyes, he was going to be transported hundreds or thousands of miles away to some totally unknown place, and maybe this time he wouldn't even be able to get back again. But as the days wore on, Huang continued to wake up in his own bed in Beigao, which over time kind of made him feel more secure that whatever happened to him was a one-time thing and it's not going to happen again. However, Huang would be wrong. On September 8th, 1977, so 3 weeks after Huang had returned back home, he went to sleep in his bed in the village of Beigao, but when he woke up the next morning, he was not there. The first thing Huang noticed when he woke up that morning were the sounds around him were totally different. They were not right. Normally, when he was asleep in his home, he would hear the sound of his mother and father snoring right by him, and he might hear some insects or birds out his window. And those sounds were gone. Instead, he heard what sounded like footsteps, but not ordinary footsteps. They were footsteps of somebody walking on cement who was wearing high heels, like a clicking sound. And then Huang also became aware of the fact that his face was clearly pressed up against cement. He was laying on the ground. But Huang couldn't open his eyes. As hard as he tried, he couldn't do it. He couldn't move his body. And so he's just laying there on cement with his eyes closed, listening to the sound of these footsteps, these high heels, getting closer and closer and closer. And as they did, his anxiety was growing and growing. He had no idea who this person was. And then these footsteps, they got right up to him and then passed by him. And Huang felt the breeze as this person walked right past him. And then after this person in high heels had kind of walked off in the other direction, Huang finally was able to wrench open his eyes, and he sat up and he looked around, and one, he couldn't find anybody. It was totally abandoned all around him. So whoever had those high heels on had somehow vanished in plain sight. And then also, as Huang continued to look around him, it looked like he was in the middle of this city. But again, there's nobody out there. It's like this abandoned city street. All he had in front of him was this clock up on a building that said 1 a.m. And so pretty soon, Huang was just kind of walking in circles, screaming out for help. And right when he was about to just start sprinting in any one direction in hope that help would be somewhere out there, Huang felt a tap on his shoulder. And then the person tapping him from behind him said, "Are you Huang Yan Cho?" Huang spun around and he saw there were these two men in military uniforms standing there. And for a second, Huang felt relieved. Somebody was here to help him. But then he thought to himself, how do they know my name? What's going on here? And so he asked them, how do you know my name? But the two men didn't answer Huang. Instead, they told him that he was at a Shanghai railway station 700 miles from Beigao, and that they, these two soldiers, were here to take Huang to a nearby army base. At this point, Huang was so scared, he just didn't know what to do. So he just wound up going with these two soldiers who put him in the back of a Jeep. And then they hopped in and began driving, and they drove him out of this weird abandoned city where he had woken up. And after driving for some time, they arrived at this huge army base that had all these rows of fencing around it with razor wire on top and all these sentries that guarded all the doors. and these two soldiers brought him through several of these checkpoints. And then when they reached the very last one, they stopped the car, they got out, Huang got out too, and the two soldiers that were with him grabbed Huang's shoulders, and they basically led him through the last checkpoint, which was manned by armed guards. And as Huang was led through this gate, the armed guards seemed to not even notice the soldiers or Huang. It was like they were invisible to the armed guards. But either way, they got through the final checkpoint, and then the two soldiers that were carrying Huang led him to this kind of nondescript big building, and they opened up a door, and they began walking down this long hallway that kind of zigged and zagged. It was like a maze of different directions you could go. And then finally, they brought Huang right to this big door that said division headquarters over it. And then before Huang could say anything, one of the two soldiers that was with him knocked on the door. And then before anybody could respond, that same soldier reached down, opened it up, swung the door in, and then they pushed Huang inside, and they stepped in after him and shut the door behind them. In front of Huang was this big desk, and sitting behind this desk was a very senior-looking military official wearing a uniform. And this official, when they looked up and saw Huang standing there, they got up to their feet and put their hands on their gun and said, "What are you doing here? How'd you get in here?" And Huang, sensing there was something wrong, threw his hands up to show he was not a threat and pointed behind him and said, "They brought me here." And the military official, who still had his hand on his gun, looked behind Huang and said, "Who brought you here?" And Huang, he turned around and he saw the two soldiers who had picked him up and driven him here and led him to this room. They were gone. Which was impossible because Huang would have heard them leave. He didn't hear anything. The door never opened. They just somehow were gone. A second later, the senior military official had pulled out his radio and he was screaming commands. And then another second later, armed soldiers came running into the room. They grabbed Huang, who still had his hands up. They came in, they arrested Huang, and they began asking him all these questions about how he got in here. How did you get through the guards? Did you climb the fence? Did you cut the fence? How did you get in here? It's not possible that you are here right now. But Huang did not have any answers. All he could say was, "The two soldiers, they brought me here." A couple of days later, Huang would be bussed back to Beigao, and again, his friends and family and everybody in town had all these questions about what happened, but again, Huang just had no answers. And then just 11 days after coming back home the second time, Huang would disappear again. And this time he would tell people he encountered two men who told him they were the same two men from the other two times he had gone missing. You had the first instance where he woke up and two police officers in white picked him up off the ground and brought him to the deportation center. And then the second time was the military base where you had those two soldiers who brought him through the gates and brought him to division headquarters. Basically, these two men he encountered on the third trip were saying they were the same men across all three instances. And on this third instance that he went missing, Huang said these two men put him on their backs and they flew him to 9 different cities around China for reasons unknown, and then they flew him back to Beigao and just dropped him off right outside his house near a tree, and that was it. Now, of course, this final disappearance sounds the most absurd because what, he was flying on the backs of people to all these different cities? That doesn't make any sense. But when Huang was kind of aggressively questioned about this third story, because it sounded the most made up as compared to the other two, it would turn out Huang had all this kind of insider information about each of the 9 cities that he supposedly was flown to by these two men. He knew the weather in each of those cities on the night that he was gone. He knew what shows were playing on the night he was gone. And he also just had really specific descriptions of where he was in each of these cities when they got there that all checked out. Now, you gotta remember that getting that information correct would have been really hard for Huang at the time. He did not have internet access. He didn't have a phone. He didn't have a car. I mean, he lives in an isolated small village in rural China. So the idea that literally the morning after all this happens, he's flown to these different cities, that he would have all this information perfectly correct, that's hard to do. That would be hard to lie about. As of today, no one has ever been able to debunk Huang's stories.
Basically, there's enough legitimacy and verifiable information in his stories that you really can't discount them. They really could have happened. Add in the fact that Huang actually took a lie detector test and passed it, and suddenly you're looking at a story that, as crazy as it sounds, really could have happened. And so Huang's story today is considered far and away the most famous UFO story in China's history, because the leading theory here is that Huang must have been abducted by aliens, and that's how he was being moved around to all these places, and maybe those two men that kept showing up in each of these events were the extraterrestrials that had scooped him up. Nobody knows, but that is the theory. As for Huang, he wishes none of this had ever happened, because his disappearances and whatever happened to him basically wrecked his life. His fiancée broke up with him because she was so uncomfortable around him, and there was a lot of stigma around Huang, especially in the village where everybody thought he was a liar. And then on top of that, all these news and film and TV crews came to the village because they wanted to shoot shows and documentaries about Huang, and Huang did not want anything to do with them. But again, like, all these people are coming to the village for Huang, and it's making the rest of the villagers upset. And then also there was a really lengthy investigation by the police and by the military to try to figure out how in the world Huang got into that army base. I mean, there were layers and layers of security that he somehow got through, and all those armed guards that were watching the gates said they never saw Huang walk through, even though Huang said he literally just walked through the gate with the two soldiers that were carrying him through. And so today, Huang actually still lives in Beigao, and he had a son and a daughter, and he has grandkids, but he refuses to talk about what happened to him because, again, it wrecked his life. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen's podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Runful, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts.